I'm Isaac BenEzra, host and co-producer of Conversations. And if you take a real good look at my guest, you'll recognize him. He's one of the progressive coalition in Congress representing the people of the 1st Congressional District for 20 years now. And he didn't come in happy, so somehow or other we're going to have to say to John, the burden is not yours alone. The public is interested. Your citizens in your community are interested enough to keep sending you back so you can be punished over and over again. But that's better. That's better. We need to see the famous John Olver smile. John, I invited you because, like many Americans, what's been going on in Washington is not untypical, but it's sort of a new low. The things that really matter never really got put forward. While they were talking about deficits, every day thousands of people were losing their jobs. More and more people were foreclosed. The war still goes on. And what do we have to show for it? A deal that was not made in heaven. John, why did you vote against that deal?
I voted against it because it wasn't really getting at the core of the problem. The problem that we really needed to be working on was the fact that we had an enormous deficit, not of dollars, but enormous deficit of jobs. We are now something like 12 million jobs short of where we need to be. And that, of course, we were talking about deficits when we should have been talking about something else. But in fact, there were no deficits. There's a little bit of history that one needs to understand. At the end of the Clinton administration, for the first time in 40 years, we had 3 years in a row of surpluses in our yearly budgets. Surpluses. And it was likely that we were going to have surpluses long into the future because, as you know, the last few years of the Clinton administration, which was also functioning under split government, the Congress was a majority of Republicans at the last several years, but we are the ones, when we held both the House and the Senate, the Democratic side, in the first 2 years of Clinton's administration, that the kind of fiscal crisis that had come out of the end of the Reagan years, when taxes were lowered and then taxes were raised, and there was a recession at the end of that period of time. We were at a time when we were carrying the largest deficits year by year that had ever been run in the country. And so there was a lot of pressure on President Clinton to deal with the deficit situation at that time. And he chose to do what I think is the right thing to have done. He chose to cut some programs, significantly some programs, and raise revenues. Raise revenues, which means some of it is taxes and some of it's not taxes, but raise revenues. In so doing, actually slightly more than half of that program was in additional revenues, more than half, and less than half in the upper 40% were for cutting programs that were not unnecessary or weren't as effective as they might have had been hoped they would be, and so on. And 55% of it roughly was for additional revenues. And we had the best growth in all the years since the end of the Second World War, the best growth in jobs, a real boom set of years. And that led to 3 years in a row of revenue surplus. Well, President Bush came in, and he wanted to do something else. He wanted to make cuts in taxes, and he got Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who in testimony late in the 1990s was saying, at the rate that we have of revenues coming in and surpluses in those last 3 years, we're going to pay down the whole of the American debt. The whole debt, which at that time was only about $5.5 trillion, so quickly that that in itself will disrupt the markets. It will put so much money back into places rather than it being held in the debt of the American debt, where we've always been very good about paying our debts. And he said that it would be appropriate. He said it would be appropriate. He was always good at couching what he was saying in very careful terms, for there to be some tax cutting in order to not have such a large surplus. Well, President Bush then, with the majorities that he had in both House and the Senate, that was the only time that there was one party government, truly. They cut $4 trillion out of the tax programs coming in, and immediately started running big deficits. Every one of the Bush years was a deficit year, every single one.
People don't remember history.
No, they don't remember that, do they?
They don't remember history because, unfortunately, we don't. The major information sources don't come from public access stations. They come from commercial stations.
And we're only interested in what's going on today and what will sell the advertising today.
Yeah.
And
precisely.
In the short future.
But there's something else that's also happened, and it's a bipartisan problem. We're in virtual wars. It seems like we're never going to get out of it, and that's been very costly, not only in terms of our young people who've been sacrificed for what people are asking more and more.
When you say virtual wars, what do you mean?
I mean the wars without ends.
All right, virtual wars. I see virtual in terms of virtually interminable.
That's right.
Virtual also means imaginary. Means in the imagination, as opposed to
what I mean, Congressman.
All right. Well, anyway, you're right. Well, I got as far as the cuts in taxes, $4 trillion in cuts in taxes, which immediately threw us into deficit spending again. But he also got us into 2 wars, which were not paid for. Never in our history had we done tax reduction at the same time that we were trying to execute war in our own national security. And in so doing, all of the money that has been expended on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it comes to $2 trillion of expenditure, all of that was borrowed money rather than paid for out of our budgets. So that means that since it was borrowed, that means $2 trillion more of debt, so that by the end, and then you follow that up, the third big item, the third largest item, was that in that administration they did not do anything to control Wall Street. Wall Street had discovered after the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which allowed big investment banks to have the same powers as the smaller banks, they then created all these different derivatives that were sold all over the world. Nobody knew who held the mortgages, and our rating agencies, Standard & Poor's and Moody's and Fitch's in Britain, they all called those things AAA. They gave them AAA ratings when they were junk bonds from the very beginning. They were junk bonds because they had nothing behind them. Those mortgages were sold to people who had no possible chance of ever paying them back.
That's what happened. Is that continuing?
That's what Wall Street would like to continue because they don't realize, they don't accept, they do not admit that they did something wrong in that period. And so we ended up slipping very quickly into recession. In '07, the housing bubble broke, began to crumble in '06 and '07, and we slipped into recession at the end of '07. And throughout '08, we were already in recession. We were losing hundreds of thousands of jobs every month. And Obama is elected president. After all of that, 2 wars without being paid for, reduction in taxation, where 90% of the reduction went to the 10% richest of Americans. 90% of the reduction, of the tax reduction, went to the 10% highest income people in the country, the ones who didn't need that kind of reduction at all. Maybe the lower 90% could well have used it, and we would support keeping it for the lower 90% in any case over the long haul and making those permanent over the long haul. But for the top 10%, that's big money. The top 10%, that's actually the income of a member of Congress is at about the 2% level. We probably stand at about the 98%, maybe the 97%. So it comes below our level of income that people were getting a step forward by the tax reduction. But for the rest of the 90% of the population, their incomes, their real incomes have remained stagnant over a 30-year period, not just in the Bush administration, but all the way back to 1980. For 90% of them, the American population, that gets you up to, of course the incomes have been rising, but that gets you up to somewhere around $100,000 income per year. Their incomes have not been going up, whereas those above that, those up into the millionaires and the billionaires and the hedge fund managers and people at that level, people who are on very low tax rates in the first place because their tax rates are based upon all of their income being capital gains, and that's now at the lowest tax rate, interestingly enough. People who are working and have no way of avoiding it, all they're doing is paying their withholding taxes, and they have their withholding for paying income taxes, but they also are paying their amount into Social Security Trust Fund. For people at that level, they have no way of avoiding taxes. There's very, very little fraud or avoidance of taxes or evasion of taxes on the part of people who have only withholding taxes and paying their Social Security amount into the trust fund. While at the upper level, if you've got a bunch of lawyers able to find every tax loophole that you can possibly take account of, then you have corporations who are paying no taxes whatsoever, or corporations that are making enormous profits. As we know, in the oil companies, the major corporations are making huge, huge profits and still being given subsidies by the federal government. That's why we're in the trouble we're in. We are giving away money and subsidies and tax breaks to the very wealthiest folk in this country who are doing very well indeed. And they don't seem to want to, except Warren Buffett maybe, who is Warren Buffett and some others like Bill Gates didn't want us to do that in the first place. They didn't want to do those tax cuts. They said, we don't need those kinds of tax cuts. And that's how we got to the point of having such huge deficits. That plus the wars, plus the housing bubble bust, and has taken several $1 trillion out of the assets, unrealized assets, but on paper assets, because the value of a moderate income family's assets is really the value of their home. And the mortgage crisis took huge gobs, huge bites out of the assets that they had available to them. So now we have 12 million people that have not, do not have jobs.
And we
And
have,
we're not getting them back at all. Every month for the last 2 years, we've been supposedly out of the recession since July of 2009. It's now August of 2011. In the last 2 years, there has not been, there have been only 3 or 4 months in all that time where we were actually creating in the private sector new jobs in a number greater than what you would have to have just to keep up with the population. And the average over that whole 2 years, the whole 24 months, has an average growth in jobs of under $100,000, 100,000 jobs per month, when you need 125,000 jobs per month just to take care of those people who are coming of age and going into the workforce. So we have not filled any of the jobs that were lost. The roughly 10 million jobs that had been lost during the fiscal crisis, when at the highest point we were losing 850,000 jobs in a month. That was the month that Obama was inaugurated in. We were already at the very bottom of that recession. As soon as he was inaugurated, within 1 month we had passed a stimulus bill, which is always called, if you listen to the Republican spokesman, and they're very good, everyone talking about the stimulus always adds the word failed. The failed stimulus. Well, after the stimulus was passed, the job loss immediately slowed down. Immediately, we started to, the economy was still slipping, we were still in recession, the economy was still slipping, but the job loss went down several months, and by 6 months later, the economy was beginning to grow again. And on the basis of several of the indicators that the economists look at in determining when you're in recession, we were out of recession. But we are not growing since that time.
John, I'm going to break in at this point because for many Americans, the recession is not over.
It isn't.
You know that.
It isn't over. For anybody who doesn't have a job, it certainly isn't over, and the job growth is so slow.
So the point I'm making is that what we need to hear from the minority or majority of Congress, what are we going to do to put people back to work? What are we going to do to put forth a plan for building America's infrastructure and creating new jobs instead of being dependent on a military-industrial complex?
Well, if you have sold to the American people that the stimulus that we already did was a failure, it was just too small, and too much of it went into still tax reduction. In the year 2008, when we were slipping quickly into the recession, when we had started into the recession, we on the Democratic side were in the majority in the House and the Senate. We wanted to do a stimulus. The President Bush, said under no circumstances would he do any stimulus except tax reduction. So we did what, it was the only thing he would sign, because he had a party which had enough votes to override any veto of his, and he was going to veto anything else. We passed a bill with almost $200 billion of tax reduction in early 2008, while Bush was still president. He signed that, and it made no effect at all on the slide, the downward slide of jobs, on the loss of jobs month after month after month as it went on throughout 2008. And so that goes to show how little effect, especially when you do it the way it was done. It was done in that instance, because that was what he would sign, a bill that actually sent checks to people over a 2-month period. So that money, that $200 billion, went out very quickly. If it was going to have an effect, you would see the effect of it on the recession. It had no significant effect at that time, and the job loss continued. What happened was people paid off a credit card bill or or bought something that may have been a necessity, or put it into savings, or whatever it happened to be, but it had no effect in terms of the economy and going forward. So when we ended up doing the stimulus bill in 2009, the one that we passed and got passed without a single Republican vote on either side, it had about $200 billion of infrastructure expenditure, which has been done over a period of time. And infrastructure expenditure takes a certain amount of time to get the jobs done. It's still being expended even now. Some of the money's for safe grid, smart grid, and for water and sewer facilities around the country, and for high-speed rail and passenger rail, things of that sort. Some of those monies are still expending out, and still the planning and the construction is started in many cases, but not completed. So it's still being spent out. And we need, very largely, we need a huge program for more infrastructure. And instead, we're now in a position where the Congress is talking about, Congress on the House side, where it's in the hands of the Republican Party, they are now talking about passing a surface transportation bill which is half the size of the last one that we had passed in 2005, when the Republicans were in charge of all branches, the presidency and both the House and the Senate. They weren't worried about deficits at that point. They had no concern about deficits at all as they were voting for them, for the policies that created them in the first place, or as the president was not doing anything to manage what Wall Street was doing. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the Treasury, the Commodities Futures Trading Corporation, all of those were supposed to be watching what's going on and keeping track. They had the power to look at what the banks were doing, the big banks, the big investment banks. They did nothing about it. They just let them go, let them continue to sell mortgages to people who had no income, no down payment, and no possible chance, and no job. No money coming in, no income, no money for a down payment, and so on. And when all of those variable rate mortgages matured, they had no way. All of that went down the drain. And it took down with it a lot of good housing that was perfectly reasonable and could have been paid for, but as people saw the loss in their value and 30 and 40% of the value go away, they decided, hey, we better step back and get out of this. And so it's kept this whole housing bubble. We aren't out of that, and there's no visible way that you can see that we're going to get out of that housing problem. Over the 1 month is up a little bit, the next month it's down a little bit. It's in the toilet. The housing market is in the toilet. In some parts of this country, they are still undergoing mortgage foreclosures, and the big banks have been now shown by some of the investigations how poor their procedures have been in forcing people into foreclosure, and so they're continuing it along the way. The one thing that has not been touched one bit, the one part of our population that has not been touched one bit by the crisis is Wall Street. Wall Street is going on. They're giving their bonuses. They're giving out their high pay levels. They're taking their huge fortunes back. Many of them should be in jail. Frankly, a good number of people ought to be in jail, but nobody has been in jail except Madoff, who is doing right up front a Ponzi scheme. While the other big banks on Wall Street were doing a casino. They were running a casino, essentially. And the people who run the casino never lose. So that's exactly what's happened. They have won in the process. Everybody else has lost.
John, you're painting a picture of reality But what do we tell people today who are out of work, who are unable to afford housing, who still don't have health care or are in danger of losing their health care? What can we expect from Congress at the rate we're going?
Well, we need to fight harder. We need to do a better messaging process for one thing, very clearly. We have been sold on the idea that you have to cut the budgets. Cut the budgets. Cutting the budgets now, severely cutting the budgets, which is what we did in coming up with a bill finally to get through 2011. And that's what's being proposed again for 2012, that there be cuts from those budgets, in the public budgets. What that does is put public employees out of work. Public employees in the federal agencies that are put out of work are going to not have money to buy things, and therefore the demand is going to go down. And while corporations in this country, for the most part, are doing very well right now, the big corporations are making quite sizable profits. Many of them have huge reserves that they are sitting on, which in a normal growth out of a recession, you would end up seeing them starting to buy, to add jobs again. They are not adding jobs because they can't see how what they are making, if they are manufacturing organizations, what they are making is going to be bought when there's fewer people having the money to buy, if you're putting people out of work. And at the same time, in our so-called failed stimulus, which really worked very well because we put some money into state budgets that were having trouble so that they were able to keep municipalities going and their own states able to pay for Medicare for poor people. We gave them a fair amount of money in that original stimulus in '09 that allowed them not to have to cut their Medicaid budgets or raise the taxes at their level, which is tough at the state level. Even if it's tough, it's even tougher than it is at the federal level, because they often have things like Props 2.5 and other limiting procedures, and they can't run at a deficit budget at all. So here we are now. We are in a position where we are not being able to put any money into the budgets that will help states with their continuing crisis of payments at the state level, not to be able to put teachers, to keep teachers working. We have all over this state and lots of states around the country, not all, but most, if your unemployment rate is over maybe 6% or thereabouts, and there are a few states that have under that have done better. North Dakota's done very well. Wyoming is doing very well. They are, for reasons that really seem to relate to the coal and oil business. There's strip coal mining in Wyoming and natural gas and oil, natural gas mainly in North Dakota, that those businesses are doing well because we're continuing to use more energy. We seem to manage with our population growth. We still seem to use more energy every year. And so those states have been doing so fairly well. But there are others. There was an editorial in the New York Times just in the last couple of days, I think it was Sundays, about the problems that states are having with their budgets, and that they are having to continue to tighten the belt and cut out on aid to their municipalities, to their communities, which means, again, public employees, class sizes are going to go up, teachers are going to be laid off, firefighters and policemen and other state employees and public employees are going to be put out of work in many of the states, and that's more people out of money, out of jobs, unable to buy, and is going to mean that it's going to extend the recession. We are in deep danger of going back into a double-dip recession. I think it has deepened, and specifically deepened by the agreement that was reached for the debt reduction in getting the debt ceiling raised. That agreement is going to cause us to tighten belts at exactly the wrong time when our economy is weak anyway, and we're putting out of work jobs at the state and municipal level and at the federal level in significant numbers. That is then going to mean that the recession returns.
I think hearing this, it sounds like there's very little real good news. It's horrific.
I don't see much good that's happening at the moment.
And yet...
You see, go back, I gave you what happened in the Clinton years. He had a crisis of not the magnitude of the one that was created by the huge tax cuts to the wealthy who had the income that they didn't need the tax cuts. That plus the two wars, unpaid for, all of it being paid for with borrowed money, mostly from China, and this housing crisis, which they caused by their, I don't think they caused it deliberately, I will not say that. But on the other hand, the policy, the overall policy, is George Bush's revenge. It is a policy that has sent us into a recession, and each one of those steps along the way have produced the situation that we have come into at the present time. And now we have, how do we get out of it? Well, Clinton balanced revenue increases from the higher income peoples, a surcharge. It was a surcharge on the tax rate, the highest tax rate, which of course, after the Second World War, our highest tax rate was 90%. The marginal tax rate was 90% for people of higher income. Over the years, it was dropped, first in the Reagan years to about 70, then in the Carter years to about 50. Excuse me, I got those turned around. By the end of the Reagan years, it had dropped all the way down to 35. The Reagan and Bush 1 years, it had topped all the way to 35, and then in the Clinton years, there was a surcharge tax of 10% put on the 35, so it went up to 39.6. Went up from, excuse me, it was 36%, and 10% was 3.6%. That surcharge went on. That was where most of the money from revenues raised was coming from, and the economy boomed. You see what happened here just a few days ago when we passed the debt ceiling by doing only cutting. And our junior senator is saying for the new debt commission that raising revenues is off the table. He said it's off the table. He voted for the debt ceiling increase here just a few days ago, but now he's saying any revenues are off the table. That is the mantra. That's why it is so depressing, because this new commission of 12 members, 3 from each party in each branch, 3 House Democrats, 3 House Republicans, 3 Senate Democrats, 3 Senate Democrats, they're going to be at loggerheads because they start out with the Republicans saying no revenues may be raised in the face of people like the very richest of Americans, like Buffett and Gates, saying you've got to get money where the money is. You know, you rob banks because there's money there. You raise revenues if you want to in the legal way by passing legislation from the people who have the money. You don't take it from the people who don't have the money. You don't take it out of lower income people by cutting Social Security, cutting Medicare, trying to privatize those. This is all part of a movement of wealth from middle-class people to the very wealthiest of Americans, which has happened, as I said. It's not just the Bush years or the
Reagan.
or our years. Now, it goes all the way back to 1980. It truly started with 1980. It was about 1980 that the gap between middle class and the very wealthiest went started growing and growing swiftly year by year by year. And that one is not easy because with the Citizens United case that the Supreme Court decided, you heard Mitt Romney, who is supposedly the front runner for the presidential nomination on the Republican side, you heard Mitt Romney say, or you've been told in the press, that what he said was to a question of why don't we raise taxes on corporations, and he said, well, you know, corporations are people.
Yes, I heard that.
That's maybe not an exact quote, but that's the gist of it.
That's pretty close.
Pretty close.
Yeah.
Corporations are people. If that's what you believe, that corporations are people, then we are in deep, deep doo-doo.
Well, the Supreme Court seems to think so by that
By a
latest,
5-4 margin. But it is
you know,
what the Supreme Court is.
I hate to break in. I feel like saying, John, we're out of time, but what I really want to say is...
You got to go and
no,
take a drink of beer.
No, what I want to say is I think America is running out of time, and we need to take very seriously your message today. John, stay healthy. Keep on fighting. We love you.
Thank you.
And that's it for Conversations. I'm exhausted, and I haven't said a lot of words. But these are real tough times, and I don't know whether the message is going to be very happy one for the people who are under tremendous pressure. And it's not only the ones who are out of work and losing their homes, but it's their families and their friends. And we're all in for tough times. So we have to kind of decide, what are we going to do about it? Well, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. See you next week. Goodbye now.